So we're going to look in a little bit more detail at a particular production from the 1880s, directed by Henry Irving, with Irving himself playing Macbeth and Ellen Terry playing Lady Macbeth, and raises. First of all, I think it's a decent illustration of kind of dominant style of Shakespearean production at the time. It also raises some issues that are important to know about in terms of your own historical research into the period. So there are a wide range of research sources available for this piece, and we're going to look at one of them in particular, one of Ellen Terry's surviving costumes. But what I want to raise about, particularly looking at this productions in this period, quite often there can be a number of separate designers and craftspeople associated with the work, and it can be difficult to sort of pick out what's important and less important about this. So, for example, the sets and most of the costumes for this production are designed by a designer called Charles Cattermole. But Ellen Terry's costumes are designed by her personal costume designer, a lady called J.W. Cummins Carr. And Terry's relationship with Carr is a sort of story unto itself. But there's two separate designers involved. Additionally, there are engravings of the designs which are made by other artists and which are to a greater or lesser extent partial reimaginings of the designs in order to create works that are suitable to sell on to the public. Additionally, not so much in this show, but in some productions, you will find artists who are employed to do the preliminary visuals for the show, and then other designers and artists come along to interpret those. So there can be a kind of a matrix of design contributions that you have to kind of pick the bones out in order to understand what you're really looking at. So the first piece we'll look at is a painting by John Singer Sargent of Ellen Terry in the role of Lady Macbeth. Sargent is, I suppose, the preeminent society portraiturist of the period. So, if you were part of the great and the good of Victorian high society in this period, then a portrait by Sargent would be pretty much essential to have in the family home. And the painting is an important one for theatre historians. Obviously, it captures a kind of key actor of the period in a key role of the period, and tells us a good deal about what the presentation of that role might have looked like, what the costume might have looked like. But I think also the fact that Sargent has painted it, it gives us a really good indication of the kind of social status that Terry enjoyed, and the status that her performance of Macbeth enjoyed in the kind of in the cultural imagination of the period. Now, as it happens, as well as the painting, um, we have the original costume. The National Trust still hold a fairly large collection of Ellen Terry's costumes, which are very beautifully conserved. And so Carr's original designs exist, the original costume exists. And you'd have to say, by any standards, it's a really interesting interpretation of Lady Macbeth. Um, the costume sort of tries to synthesize um, kind of reptilian, snake-like qualities, along with some kind of sense of medieval armor, and a really strong kind of Saxon Celtic silhouette. So it's really fusing both a very acute sense of period, um, a very acute sense of character analysis in terms of the designs, and a really strong metaphor for the character. You know, this idea of a combination of a snake and a warrior. The other thing that I think is really extraordinary about it is that red wig, that huge volume of red hair hanging down almost to her knees. It's a really kind of extraordinary, vivid depiction of a woman who is hell bent and arguably hell destined in pursuit of power. And then I just wanted to turn to some of Catamol's surviving costume designs for the work. I don't think that any of Irving's actual costumes survive, but Catamol's designs do. And it's worth having a look through these, not least because there's such beautiful examples of the highly illustrative and detailed style that we find in Victorian costume design this period, and we see how highly valued that sense of period detail is in these designs, and how valued the sense of accuracy and period integrity is. Now, this creative and aesthetic investment in a sense of realism, a sense of historical accuracy, of course, isn't just to do with costume, it's also to do with the settings and the props. And therein lies one of what is going to become one of the major problems with this approach to scenography, and it's this. Um, when Shakespeare wrote these pieces, generally speaking, he had in mind the open playing spaces of places like the Globe, theatres which didn't have this kind of reliance on scenery. And when Irving and others make this commitment to creating these kind of visual realities, what they also commit to is fairly extreme tonnage of scenery. And the challenge with that is that the pace of the narrative, which is so important to Shakespeare working in performance, then gets abruptly held up by the scenic requirements and the scenic expectations of the piece. But whilst on the one hand, there is this real interest to create highly naturalistic, illusionistic, convincing spaces, the scenic requirement of that robs the drama of its pace and its narrative. So pieces which are intended to move on very briskly um, actually get terribly slowed down by the need to change scenes from one location to another. And what we'll look at next are some of those very practical challenges that naturalism creates in Victorian theatre.